Good morning. Welcome to another episode of Stand on Guard. I'm your host, David Krayden, and we will be joining James Manson very shortly of the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. And we're looking forward to this because lots is happening. And I'm hearing a lot of people say, we definitely need some movement in Parliament right now because this could go on indefinitely. I think that's extremely relevant. And I think what James and the center are trying to do is essentially challenge this government to wake up. And it cannot dismiss Parliament. It has to be responsible to Parliament. We'll be right back. We need a political change, but we also need to resolve to resist. To show you a bit of a clip to show you what is actually not happening right now with the Liberal leadership. Nobody wants to get on board. And I have found this absolutely fascinating. James is here. Great. Thanks for your patience this morning, folks, and welcome to the show, James.
Thanks very much, David. Good morning. Sorry about the technical difficulties just now, but here we are.
Here we are. Yeah. So, just in case anybody has any doubt of what's going on here, that you are the lead attorney for the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms challenge to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's prorogation of Parliament. And you're acting on behalf of two individuals. I think this is quite interesting because you did not do this unilaterally as an organization, but you're responding to David McKinnon and Aris Lavranos, I believe from Nova Scotia or the Maritimes. And I guess my first question is, can you walk us through why you think this is even feasible? I understand it's based on a precedent in the UK with the UK Supreme Court saying Boris Johnson should not have prorogued Parliament in 2019 around the Brexit agreement.
Yes, David. Well, thanks. And let me just say hello to all of the viewers. You're quite right. We are lawyers from JCCF, for the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. Everybody can find us at jccf.ca. And a little bit of a quick plug, if anybody would like to support the case, certainly check us out. Again, jccf.ca. Anybody wishing to donate to the case would be much appreciated. David, turning to your question, we are acting for Eris and David out in Nova Scotia. A couple of concerned citizens, who basically agreed and approached us to, help them out. And in terms of the viability of the case, um, you're also quite right, David. This does relate to the 2019 Boris Johnson prorogation in the United Kingdom, and really, we're going to be doing the same thing as what happened back then in the UK. In case we've sort of forgotten what happened with Boris Johnson. Um, Back during the Brexit negotiations back in 2019, we all may remember that there were 8 weeks to go before a hard exit from the Brexit situation with the EU, and so there hadn't yet been an agreement between the UK and the EU, and people didn't know what was going to happen, and there could have been economic and political chaos coming out of that had there not been an agreement. But anyway, in the midst of all of this, Prime Minister Johnson decided to prorogue Parliament for 5 weeks of the remaining 8 weeks before the final day of exit. And so ultimately that got challenged in the United Kingdom court system, and it made its way up to the Supreme Court very quickly within the space of a month. Within the space of a month, it went from a prorogation all the way to a decision from the Supreme Court. And that Supreme Court decision, David, excuse me, that decision from the Supreme Court basically found that Boris Johnson's prorogation was unlawful. And why was that? Well, basically, he never gave any reasons to the public for the prorogation. And so the UK Supreme Court said that there's a very important principle that we all knew about and we still know about. It's called parliamentary accountability. All right. That just means, David, that Parliament needs to be able to do its job. Parliament needs to be able to oversee and supervise the government of the day. And that means, of course, it has to be in session so that it can be in committees and be on the floor of the House of Commons to do, for the question period, things like that. And the UK Supreme Court found that because Prime Minister Johnson shut down Parliament for 5 of those 8 weeks, Parliament couldn't do its job, and particularly at a very, very difficult, period of time in the UK. So ultimately, they found that all of that meant that the Parliament had been unlawfully prorogued. And ultimately, they found that Parliament had never been prorogued. What the court said was, look, the Prime Minister's advice to the Queen was unlawful, and it basically was a nullity, meaning that it had never happened, and therefore Parliament had never been prorogued, and therefore Parliament could go back to work the same, or I guess it was the following day. So in the UK, Parliament resumed sitting right away. So when you pull that back, then, David, to our case, you will see that, well, at least in our client's view, we're in the same kettle of fish, David. Basically, we're going to be saying that Prime Minister Trudeau's announcement last Monday really gave a whole bunch of reasons that don't add up to a reasonable justification. That was the catchword from the UK's decision. There's got to be a reasonable justification for the prorogation, and we're going to say that Prime Minister Trudeau's reasons don't add up to a reasonable justification.
Well, I think most Canadians would probably concur with that assessment. I find it interesting that Justin Trudeau was on MSNBC over the weekend with Jen Psaki, and he was asked about prorogation and does he think this is going to in any way impede his negotiations with President-elect Donald Trump? And of course, this tariff is coming next Monday, a week from today. There's
Right.
nothing Trudeau is going to do in the next week to stop it. I think most Canadians realize that. But Trudeau responded, interestingly enough, he said, I have all the tools at my disposal that I need, even though Parliament's not sitting. At the same time, Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly is on CTV's question period yesterday, and she's saying all political parties need to pull together right now in a show of unity. And this is the same government that just dismissed all of these political parties from the House of Commons, and it's essentially silenced them in a very legislative way, at least. Yes, they're free to go to the media, but legislatively they have been cut out of the process. And I think this is outrage, Canadians, because this is clearly a political partisan move on behalf of Justin Trudeau. Anybody can see that. He talked about this being a great reset, which reminded me of things he said before about great resets. But I don't think. Do you think the Governor General Mary Simon had a choice when Trudeau came to her and said, "I want to prorogue Parliament"? Apparently, it took her about 10 seconds to make up her mind about that, and she literally came back and said, "Go ahead." Not even thinking. She didn't even take an hour to think about it. But do you think that did she have did she have the constitutional authority to say no? There's no reason for this. And as Governor General, I'm saying no. That's my role. That's my constitutional authority.
So, David, I think you raise a couple of interesting and excellent points. And there's a couple of things that I want to say just off the bat in response. Number one, I want to make it clear to the viewers that this court challenge that we're doing is not based in political considerations. We're talking about a legal and a constitutional challenge. our clients are more concerned not with the government of the day and who happens to be in charge and whether Prime Minister Trudeau is a bad politician or a good leader or what. This has nothing to do with that. This is more about the entire working of the constitutional order in our government, in our system. It doesn't matter whether it's a conservative prime minister or a liberal prime minister or any other prime minister. The question that this lawsuit seeks to answer is, what are those limits? What are the limits of a prime minister's power to dissolve or not dissolve, prorogue parliament, pardon me? What are those limits? Because there must be some limits. Naturally, I think everybody would agree that a prime minister can't just prorogue parliament forever. So that means there must be some limits. Well, what are those limits? That is an important question that's never been answered before here in Canada. And I think it's very important for all Canadians and also politicians, future prime ministers, to understand exactly how far they can go to use this extraordinary tool called prorogation. So, David, then turning to your next question with respect to the Governor General, my view is that we don't want to be testing or criticizing the Governor General for agreeing to the advice given by the Prime Minister. Over time, David, what's happened, of course, in our society, or rather in our government, is that the Prime Minister has become the person who wields all the power. We don't really have a Governor General who's got any real particular power in this case. And I don't think we want that. I don't think we want to have a Governor General that can stop for a minute, think about things, and then say, you know what? No, I'm not going to do it. That would be extraordinary for Governor General Mary Simon in this case to stand up to Prime Minister Trudeau, shall we say, and say, no, Prime Minister, I'm not going to grant you prorogation because for whatever reason. Now we have a different power base in our government. We have a Governor General who is saying no to the democratically elected people, right? We must remember, David, that nobody elected Governor General Simon. Nobody elected the King. Of course, she's the King's representative here in Canada. And I don't think we want to be, moving back to the olden times when the king had unlimited authority to stop the democratic processes of the government. Naturally, I appreciate that some people are very unhappy with the way this all went down, and perhaps they're quite unhappy with the way the government has gone on for the last few years or even the entire time. I appreciate that, but I don't think that that is cause to call upon a another person, for example, the Governor General, to sort of overrule the Prime Minister's decision. Whether we can get there depends on, at least in my view, on the success of this case and whether the Prime Minister's limits, whether those limits of power, first of all, what are they? And secondly, once we answer that question, we will then ask, did the Prime Minister's decision on Monday exceed whatever that test turns out to be? I think that's the more democratic and better way of going about this.
So you're saying the impetus should be on the courts, not the Governor General. If this is an abuse of prorogation, that the courts need to intervene, not the Governor General.
I think that's the better view, David, because think about it this way. All of the viewers who are maybe, secretly hoping that the Governor General might step in and might do something, maybe if they have the government that they want next time, they wouldn't want the Governor General to be doing the same thing to their Prime Minister. So we can't really have it that way. I don't think that would be very good.
Yeah, because when I first commented on this a couple of days before it actually happened, I didn't expect this to happen so quickly. I thought she would take a couple of days.
Ah,
I encouraged people to correspond and say, please think about this decision. The right honorable governor to be respectful, but ask her please to think about it at least. Because my mind went back to 1926, and anybody who knows Canadian history would know that Mackenzie King, Prime Minister Mackenzie King, went to Governor General Byng at that time and said, I want to dissolve Parliament. I can no longer sustain my minority government, my coalition. He was working with the Progressives at the time. Lord Byng of Vimy, and this was a highly respected individual, a war hero from the Great War. he said to Mackenzie King, I can't dissolve Parliament because there's another option. The Conservative opposition should be asked to form a government. And constitutional scholars all agree that Lord Byng was correct in his assessment, that he had the constitutional authority to do that. However, I think, as you would probably point out, the public relations fallout, even in 1926, was horribly against the Governor General because it looked like he was usurping the power of the democratically elected prime minister. So I think I take your point here. This might not be the best way, but so I guess that gets me to the next question. Do you think you can win this and in a reasonable amount of time?
Short answer, yes. I think that our constitution here in Canada is very similar to that of the United Kingdom. In fact, our Constitution, David, as you may know, contains a preamble, and the preamble of the Constitution here basically explicitly says that our Constitution is supposed to be based in principle similar in principle to that of the UK. And that's, of course, because of our shared legal history, and constitutional history over the years. So, what happened in the UK, that case back in 2019 with Boris Johnson, we don't see any principal difference between what happened then and what happened here in terms of the actual, constitutional rules that ought to be set down. In the UK case, once again, it wasn't an earth shattering case, to be honest. What the Supreme Court said was simply the Prime Minister's got to have a pretty good reason to shut down Parliament for a period of time. This is the democratically elected body. And of course, David, we have to remember that Parliament is the supreme body in Canada in the federal system, not the government, right? Parliament's duty, again, is to oversee and check and supervise the government. And so anyway, the Supreme Court said that, that is an important function. So in order for the executive to shut down the legislative branch for a period of time, there's got to be a reasonable justification. I don't think that that's too much to ask for the prime minister to have some kind of a good reason. And so then we have to turn to the actual reasons that the prime minister put forward last week. Well, there's a couple of them, aren't there? There's the leadership race, argument, and there's the argument where he said that he wants to reset Parliament. And let's take the first one first. In terms of a leadership race, our client's view, David, is that that is not a reasonable justification in and of itself, because really, when you're talking about having a leadership race for the leader of the party, that's a party matter, right? That's not a government matter. We have to remember, of course, David, that um, uh, political parties are really nothing more than a collection of people that have the same views, right? Once you get elected into government, now the people who form the cabinet, they are ministers of the crown. They are not ministers of the Liberal Party. So ultimately, uh, when you're having a leadership race for your party, that's an internal matter. That's what our clients will argue anyway. And we will say that that's got nothing to do with the business of the actual government. I mean, the Liberal Party on Monday afternoon last week could have pointed to any of their members and said, this is the new interim leader. And this is going to be the new prime minister, and that's it. And then that prime minister could have gone back to Parliament the next day and faced the opposition. But that's not what happened, of course. So our view is that the first reason doesn't pass muster. The second reason, David, is to reset Parliament. Now, here's the tricky part a little bit. Oftentimes, resetting Parliament is a valid reason for having a prorogation, because what happens is a government may reach the end of its legislative agenda. They may have a few ideas for what bills to pass and what to do. And then they reach the end of that agenda. All the bills they wanted to pass got passed. Everything they wanted to, put forward got put forward. and they're at the end. So now they need to go back to the cabinet departments, and all of the cabinet ministers have to go back to their people and come up with new ideas, new legislative proposals, new policy issue areas that they want to start legislating on. And then they have to write a new speech from the throne, and they have to breathe some more life into the government and then carry on. And that's okay. Normally, that's a legislative reset, and that's, yeah, usually happens during each parliament. Not really a big deal. But here's the thing, David. Number one, it doesn't last 11 weeks. Number two, we're not talking here about a legislative reset. Prime Minister Trudeau on Monday was talking about just a reset because of the tone, or because it was paralyzed, or because everything was toxic in Parliament, and that everybody had to lower the temperature. I think, to use the Prime Minister's words. Well, in my view, I think in my client's view, again, I'm not sure that that is a reasonable justification, because there are other more democratic and more, probably impactful ways to lower the temperature. It would be called having an election. Why couldn't the prime minister simply dissolve parliament and call for an election? That would probably take care of the paralysis in parliament. Obviously, my clients read the polls as well as everybody else, and we understand that if there were an election today, likely the conservatives would win. But it doesn't matter that it's the conservatives that might win. We're just saying that there could be an easy fix to this without shutting down Parliament for 11 weeks. The other thing, of course, is why 11 weeks? If everyone just has to take a breather and lower the temperature, why is 11 weeks the necessary time frame? Why couldn't it be 2 weeks or 3 weeks? We must remember again, David, every day that goes by, Parliament cannot do its job. And of course, we still haven't mentioned the incoming economic threat from President elect Donald Trump. That is a big deal. That is a serious deal. Now, we don't know, of course, whether President-elect Trump will actually impose a tariff, but all signs point to yes. So this is the backdrop, of course, against which Parliament again can't do anything. They can't do anything right now to support the government, to pass any new legislation, to ratify an agreement that might become necessary to ratify, all these types of things, including simply standing up and asking questions on behalf of Canadians to the ministers, who are apparently now running around in the states and everywhere else, talking about things like energy, banning energy to go to the states. I think they were talking about that yesterday. All kinds of things that are on the table, apparently, said I think it was the foreign affairs minister. Well, these are all naturally of great concern to Canadians. And at the moment, as I say, Parliament can't do anything to help with the situation. And so that is obviously a real problem. So, long answer to your question, do you think we can win? Yes, I do think we can win, because I think, in our view, the reasons given by the Prime Minister don't add up to a reasonable justification. And that violates the test laid out by the Supreme Court of the UK. And one more thing, David, before I turn it back to you, sorry. Um, we have to understand as well that the UK's decision isn't binding on our courts, right? I want the viewers to be clear about that. The UK's decision is only a helpful analytical tool that we can use here. We're going to be inviting the court here in Canada to accept that reasoning. It's not binding, of course, but we'll be making that pitch to the court.
Well, you mentioned the fact that, yeah, it was Melanie Joly saying everything's on the table, including energy. I think Premier Daniel Smith of Alberta, would argue that that's ultra vires, is that the federal government has no right to say that energy is on the table. That's a provincial jurisdiction. But this is why I totally agree with what you're doing here, because this situation is fraught with so many difficulties, and there's just no response except through the media right now. And there's no legislative ability. And any kid who has taken high school history of Canada knows that our democracy is based on responsible government, that the executive branch is responsible to the legislative branch, which of course isn't happening right now. There is no
That's right.
legislative branch meeting. There's a
That's right.
cabinet, A lot of people think that the government's not operating because Parliament. Of course it is, but it's operating by decree, which of course is how dictatorships function.
That's right. That's right. David, I wanted to just interject. Yes, I'm sorry to do that, but
Go
your
ahead.
comment made me think about um, a conversation I had yesterday with another citizen, and I was telling her about the case, and she felt a little bit uncomfortable with what we were trying to do because of this grave economic threat coming from the States right now. She said, I don't know that this is the right time to plunge Canadians into an election. I mean, if you're right, James, she said, then there's going to be people are going to go back to Parliament. There's probably going to be a non-confidence motion right away, and then there's going to be an election, and that's not the right time to have an election in the middle of all this economic turmoil. I mean, don't we need people to be dealing with this rather than having all these shenanigans with respect to an election? And while I take that point a little bit, David, your comment just now about tyranny and authoritarian government and ruling by decree, that was in my mind when that person made those comments to me, because my answer was, I understand it's tough, but our Constitution must prevail. The constitutional order that we've got must prevail. Parliament must be able to do its job. And they might make a hash of it. It's true. It's possible that we end up muddling through. But the actual order, the actual way things are supposed to work, it has to work. Because if it doesn't work, if the prime minister can simply shut down parliament whenever he or she wants for whatever reason, then we are in a situation where the executive has absolute priority to do whatever it wants. That cannot be acceptable in our country. So even though things may be difficult with the whole economic threat, the what's going on in this case and these issues raised, in my view, I think in my client's view, are even more important. I'm sorry to have interjected there, David, but that was what I was thinking when you made your comment.
Not at all. That's what you're here for, because you're the expert. I'm merely commenting as a journalist who has certainly had some interest in this area for quite some time. But I find this extremely problematic, and a lot of people are asking me if they do manage to have a leadership convention and they do manage to elect a new leader. And I'm not entirely convinced this game plan is going to work. If they have to find people who actually want to run first. We have two non-entities right now who have said they're running.
Yes, and they have to come up with $350,000 apparently, which is quite a lot of money to get into the race.
Quite a lot of money. I mean, Mark Carney has that kind of money. I'm not even sure Chrystia Freeland can find that kind of money on such short notice. But this certainly looks, if it's not a ploy for Justin Trudeau to hang on to power, it's a coronation for Mark Carney. But having said that, is it possible for this government to come back on March 24th with a new leader and prorogue again, because they don't want that non-confidence vote? They want people to get to know the new Liberal leader. And is it possible for another prorogation to occur?
Interesting question, David. I guess it would be technically possible. I can't imagine how that would help them, first of all, in the eyes of the public. I can't imagine that the media would be particularly kind to them. Uh, your next question, of course, would be, can the Governor General do anything at that point? And would my opinion be any different than what I just told you 10 minutes ago? Um, Fair point. I don't know that any government would ever have the courage, shall we say, to try to prorogue a second time, just coming back from a first prorogation. That to me would be political suicide. Um, Maybe at that point the governor general might have another thing to say about it. I don't know, and frankly, I don't know how I might feel personally about it. I don't think I would want. I just said to you 10 minutes ago, David, that we don't want the governor general to be in the business of refusing things from the prime minister. To prorogue a second time, wow, that would be quite something. I'm not sure what I think about that, but I guess it's technically possible for that to happen. Um, I think, though, however, the practicalities of the situation probably will take care of it, and that's because of the money. What the viewers may appreciate, David, is that the government only has a certain amount of money every few months, and those come by way of supply bills, as you know. And so that's all sort of in line with the budget. And every few months or so, I think that they have to get together and formally pass a new legislation, which actually disperses money to the various departments of the government. So without that, the government runs out of money. And so my understanding is that there has to be a supply bill done by the end of March, which of course coincidentally dovetails with the recall of Parliament on March 24th, I think it is.
Right.
So everybody realizes that the government runs out of money at the end of March. Therefore, there must be um, a money bill laid before Parliament. That will have to be, by the way, David, as you know, I'm sure, that is a confidence bill for the. I think the viewers probably understand as well. Every time there's a money bill involved, that is automatically a confidence piece of legislation. So the vote on that particular legislation is treated as a confidence motion, essentially. So if that bill fails, then the government is basically obligated to resign. I don't know that that's technically true, but that is the long-standing convention in Canadian politics and UK politics, which is that if a money bill fails, the government's kind of obligated to resign. And that's probably what would happen in this case. And so if we're talking about um, proroguing a second time, I don't know how that could happen because if it were to be prorogued a second time, then the money bill couldn't be done, and the money bill has to be done. So if the money bill can't be done, then the whole thing runs out of money, and then we're into absolute chaos. I don't even think that. Well, I don't think any government would do that. You know what I mean? I think that is probably not going to happen. What has to happen is the supply bill needs to be tabled in the House, and then it'll be voted on, and then it'll probably fall. I mean, this is what we understand. All the opposition parties have said that they're going to vote down the government. This will be the first opportunity, of course, unless our lawsuit is successful and they're back in Parliament earlier. But at the limit, I think sometime at the end of March, there will be a voice from Parliament saying that that we have to have an election.
Well, I think that assessment will reassure a lot of Canadians who are seriously concerned that this government will continue to do whatever it takes to stay in power, including a second prorogation. But I think if you're saying that financially this is not going to happen, well, that might be the only thing that would stop them. Final question, I think, unless I had something else for you, it was the your colleague John Carpe, a friend of mine, and I've worked very closely with him on Bill C-63,
Ah,
the Online Harms Act, in a Western Standard opinion piece that Bill C-63 died with prorogation. There's been a tremendous confusion about whether or not government bills have died, whether private members' bills die, whether both die with prorogation. The parliamentary website is contradictory. In one point, it says, yes, government bills die. Another point says they don't die. Uh, the National Post recently did a piece saying that now the precedent is that government bills won't die; they'll come right back where they were. So we'll be at second reading with Bill C-63 if the House resumes. What's your assessment of that? Can we at least take that from this prorogation that bills like C-63 have died?
my understanding is that yes, they have died currently. If the prorogation is valid, and if our lawsuit does not succeed, then my sense is that yes, all the bills die on the order paper, as they say. I understand that Parliament can reconvene after the next election or whenever they come back for a new session. So let me just sort of stop and just unpack that a bit. The if prorogation is valid and we don't win, and ultimately Parliament comes back on the 24th. Now it's the second session of Parliament, not the first. So they just ended the first session of Parliament. I think it's the 44th Parliament. Now it's going to be the second session of the 44th Parliament. Again, unless we're right. So if our lawsuit prevails and my clients prevail, we will be asking the federal court to declare the prorogation basically a nullity. And that's going to mean that Parliament, just like in the UK, never was prorogued at all. So my sense of it would be that we would still be in the first session of the 44th Parliament. And that would mean if our lawsuit prevails, that in fact Parliament had never been prorogued at all. So all of the bills and all of the committees and all that would still be operating and would still be there. So there would be nothing dead. Everything would still be live until Parliament is dissolved and there's another election, or Parliament is validly prorogued, again, a second time, or maybe, or a first time for real. I don't know, however you want to characterize it. Um, and that would be that. So there's only a couple of options, but unless Parliament is prorogued validly, our solution would be that everything comes back. Well, in fact, nothing had left to begin with, right? And so that, I understand, may be of concern to some people. I share John's concerns with respect to to Bill C-63, for example. I find that that's a very, very serious bill with very, 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 very serious ramifications for our country. I'm not in favor of that bill at all from a Charter of Rights point of view. But um, but if we're right, that bill will come back, or will be there, and will never have died. It'll be up to the people in Parliament to vote down the government to have an election. That's the best way of doing this, is to dissolve Parliament and have an election.
Well, I think you submitted a very good case for that non-confidence vote occurring in the government being unable to avoid it, because a lot of people are concerned, as I said, that the government will do anything to avoid that non-confidence vote, just like Trudeau did everything he could to avoid a non-confidence vote in January, and clearly was able to do that. But if they are restrained by finances, and if this is like what happens every year in the United States when Congress runs out of money and the government is on the verge of shutting down,
Right.
that's never happened in Canada. So I
No,
think that would be a very dangerous precedent.
it would be incredibly dangerous. In fact, David, I have to say, I don't know if there is any reserve money if that ever happened. Like, let's imagine that we couldn't pass a supply bill. Imagine that for some reason. Is there any money in some kitty somewhere for the Department of National Defense, or for the Department of Foreign Affairs, or for the Department of any of these departments to keep the lights on in the middle of a legislative crisis like this? I don't even know. I think there is extra money, emergency funding for the in the States for the American system. I think they have extra money that can at least keep the lights on. I'm not sure that that's the case here in Canada. So it could be extraordinarily problematic for the Canadian government if there's no supply bill. And there is one more thing, David, I wanted to just mention, because I've seen a couple of these comments on social media recently, some kind of a theory where the government would invoke the Emergencies Act for some reason upon coming back to the House after prorogation is lifted, and then somehow trying to connive a way to stay in power beyond October's election day, the fixed election day in October, into a fifth year, because people realize that, constitutionally speaking, you don't have to have an election until every 5 years. Um, the Canada Elections Act, which is a piece of legislation, provides for a 4-year fixed election, but the Constitution says it could be 5. And so people are very concerned, or some people are very concerned, that the government will somehow find a way to get a fifth year out of this and not have an election till October 26th. I find that a little bit far-fetched. I just wanted to make sure that the viewers understood that. In my view, first of all, there wouldn't be an emergency that would necessitate the Emergencies Act. I mean, that is an incredibly difficult thing to have to do. In any event, both houses of Parliament have to convene and ratify the Emergencies Act declaration, which they probably wouldn't do because we're in a minority parliament now, and everybody would see this ploy for what it would be. And thirdly, again, the money. You'd have to come together and have a money bill, a supply bill, which would probably hamstring any type of Emergencies Act gambit. And fourthly, the Canada Elections Act does say there's got to be an election every 4 years, which would be October of this year. So they'd have to repeal that that act. I mean, the Emergencies Act declaration doesn't suspend all the other pieces of legislation, as far as I'm concerned. I think it would be very difficult for that to happen. So just to put people's minds at ease about the Emergencies Act possibility, I don't think that that's something worth worrying about.
Well, that actually was another question I did have for you. Thank
Oh,
you so much for bringing that up, because that is a concern. There is a potential for a protest in Ottawa next week called Election Now. It's being labeled as Freedom Convoy 2.0. Some people are concerned that could be construed as violent protest and a justification for the Emergencies Act. The only thing I would question about your analysis there, James, is that Trudeau did not wait for the Senate to ratify the Emergencies Act. It went through the House somewhat begrudgingly with the NDP. I think
right.
divided, but they eventually got enough support. But the Senate never passed the Emergencies Act.
Well, what happened was Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister Trudeau, he ended up revoking the declaration right before it had a chance to pass the Senate. So it was a very quickly done, quickly implemented and then quickly, rescinded. So I hear you. I hear you that that the Senate didn't have a chance to confirm the declaration, but had it done so, then the emergency could have, I guess, the emergency regulations, whatever had been passed, could have extended for longer. But ultimately, I think Prime Minister Trudeau and his government saw the writing on the wall with the Senate. I think, as I recall, and I don't have any inside information, but as I recall, the Senate it wasn't looking favorable that they were going to actually approve it. So then I think Prime Minister Trudeau pulled it. That's what I believe anyway.
Okay, so he can implement it, but it can't be sustained without.
Right. That's right.
Okay,
That's right.
that is interesting. A lot of people were totally confused as to the process.
And we have to remember as well that Justice Mosley of the federal court a year or so ago did find that the government's invocation of the Emergencies Act had been unreasonable, that there wasn't any reasonable reasons to declare it in the first place, right? I think we have to remember that very brave decision, in my view, from the federal court.
Yes, yes. Well, James, thank you so much for your time today. This has been just a pleasure talking to you about these issues and your assessment, your analysis. Much appreciated. I know my viewers will love it, and I do intend to do a follow-up article on this for the post-millennial. So thank you so much again, and you're always welcome back on this show, and I really appreciate your input today. Thank you.
Thanks again, David. One more quick plug, if you don't mind, jccf.ca for all the viewers who want to donate to this court case, if they're so minded. Every bit counts. Everything we do for all of our litigants is all done through the generosity of our donations. So jccf.ca to check us out, see what we're doing, and perhaps be as generous as you might want to be. Thanks very much.
Well, that information will be in our description, because this is one organization I have no hesitancy about supporting.
Well, that's very kind. Thank you.
And I've always had good relations with your group. So thank you so much, James. We'll see you again soon, I hope.
Thank you, David. Anytime.
Bye for now. Well, folks, that's all for today. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will Be back again tomorrow with all the news you need to know, and so we can continue to resolve to resist. And let's hope this challenge, this court challenge, is successful. And let's and as James said, support this organization. They do great work. They're fighting for you. They're fighting for Canadians, and I've always supported the work they do. So we'll be back again tomorrow, and let's keep fighting for freedom in this country. It's the best thing to fight for. Don't drink the Kool-Aid, folks. Don't listen to Justin Trudeau. We need this kind of attitude in Canada right now, because let me tell you, Justin Trudeau will fight tooth and nail to stay as leader of the Liberal Party and as Prime Minister of Canada, and he will use every trick in the Liberal handbook to do that. So we have to be vigilant, and we have to have perseverance to fight this battle to the end. As I've been saying since this station went on the air, we need to resolve to resist. And we need to fight for our free speech and our democratic rights to say what we believe, to speak, as John Diefenbaker said. And don't forget that t-shirt that's available out there in the store. I speak as a free Canadian, free to speak, free to believe in what I choose. And Justin Trudeau is not going to interfere with that. Thanks for being a part of the Krayden's Right resistance, and we'll see you again soon. So we are in a very precarious position in this country. We need a political change, but we also need to resolve to resist.